Imagine this. You are a young man named Marcus, barely 20 years old, standing in the suffocating darkness beneath the Colosseum in the year 98 after Christ. The stone walls around you drip with moisture that might be water, sweat, or blood from the arena above. Your hands shake as you grip a rusted gladius, its weight unfamiliar and terrifying in your calloused fingers. Through the wooden floorboards overhead, you hear the roar of 50,000 Romans screaming for death. Your heart pounds against your ribs as footsteps echo through the narrow corridor. A guard approaches, his keys jangling like funeral bells. In moments, you'll be dragged up into the blazing sun where wild beasts wait to tear your flesh from your bones, where trained killers will try to end your life for the entertainment of people who see you as less than human. What you don't know is that survival in this concrete hell requires choices so desperate, so morally twisted, that they would shatter the conscience of any modern person. You're about to discover that the Colosseum wasn't just an arena for gladiatorial combat. It was a machine designed to extract every possible form of human degradation for the pleasure of the masses. The slaves who fought here didn't just face death in combat. They faced systematic torture, sexual exploitation, and moral choices that would haunt them for whatever remained of their shattered lives. Think you know what happened in the Colosseum? Think again. The sanitized Hollywood version bears no resemblance to the actual horror that unfolded daily in Rome's greatest monument to human cruelty. What you're about to learn about slave survival in the arena will make modern prison documentaries look like children's television. The slaves of the Colosseum developed survival strategies so twisted, so morally complex, that they reveal the absolute depths to which human beings will sink when faced with systematic dehumanization. Before we descend into these forgotten testimonies of survival and suffering, if you value learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These buried voices deserve to be heard, and there are countless more stories waiting to be discovered. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's darkest corners. The Colosseum opened in 80 after Christ under Emperor Titus, but its construction began a decade earlier under his father Vespasian. What most people don't realize is that the arena was designed from the ground up as a machine for processing human suffering on an industrial scale. The underground chambers, called the hypogeum, weren't just holding areas for gladiators and animals. They were a complex network of torture chambers, rape rooms, and human experimentation facilities, where slaves learned that survival meant abandoning every moral principle they had ever held. The slave procurement system that fed the Colosseum's appetite for human misery operated across the entire Roman Empire. Military campaigns specifically targeted young men and women for arena entertainment. When Roman legions conquered new territories, they didn't just take prisoners of war. They conducted systematic raids designed to capture the strongest, most attractive, and most psychologically resilient individuals for transportation to Rome's gladiatorial schools. The selection process was coldly methodical. Roman slavers evaluated potential gladiators like livestock, examining their teeth, testing their reflexes, and assessing their psychological resilience through increasingly degrading tests. Only about 1 in 10 captured individuals survived the journey to Rome. The rest died from disease, exhaustion, or suicide during the brutal forced marches that could last for months. But here's what makes the Colosseum's slave system truly horrifying. The Romans didn't just want entertainment. They wanted to demonstrate their absolute power over conquered peoples by forcing them to participate in their own dehumanization. The gladiatorial games weren't just about death. They were about making slaves complicit in a system designed to destroy their humanity piece by piece. The gladiatorial schools, called ludi, were training facilities that doubled as prisons and brothels. Slaves who showed promise as fighters were subjected to intensive combat training. But this came with a cost that extended far beyond physical conditioning. The Romans had discovered that breaking a person's sexual dignity was the most effective way to ensure psychological compliance. Every gladiator, male and female, was subject to systematic sexual exploitation as part of their training regime. The lanista, or gladiator trainer, maintained the right to rent out gladiators to wealthy Romans for private entertainment. These arrangements weren't hidden or shameful. They were advertised openly, with different gladiators commanding different prices based on their combat record, physical attractiveness, and willingness to participate in degrading activities. Young male gladiators faced particular horrors. Roman society accepted the sexual domination of slaves as natural and proper. Gladiators were often forced to service wealthy Roman men and women in elaborate sexual scenarios designed to emphasize their complete powerlessness. The most successful gladiators learned to perform enthusiasm during these encounters, understanding that visible resistance would result in more brutal treatment or assignment to suicidal combat scenarios. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices, faced an even more complex web of exploitation. They were simultaneously sexualized and forced to fight, creating a twisted form of entertainment that combined violence with erotic spectacle. Wealthy Roman women paid enormous sums to attend private gladiatorial exhibitions where female slaves fought each other while partially clothed or completely naked. The training regimen itself was designed to break down normal human responses to violence and degradation. New gladiators were forced to watch experienced fighters practice on live victims, usually condemned criminals or disabled slaves deemed unsuitable for arena combat. They were required to participate in mock executions, where they learned to kill efficiently and dramatically for crowd entertainment. But the psychological conditioning went deeper than combat training. Gladiators were systematically isolated from any relationships that might provide emotional support or alternative identity. They were forbidden from forming friendships with other slaves, prohibited from discussing their previous lives, and punished severely for showing compassion toward other gladiators. The Romans understood that creating effective arena entertainment required destroying the gladiators' capacity for human empathy. Slaves who retained their ability to feel compassion for others were useless for the specific type of spectacle the crowds demanded. The Colosseum needed killers who could butcher each other with theatrical flair while the audience cheered. This is where the survival strategies became truly twisted. Gladiators quickly learned that their only hope for staying alive lay in becoming enthusiastic participants in their own exploitation. The slaves who survived longest weren't necessarily the best fighters. They were the ones who became skilled at reading crowd psychology and delivering the specific type of performance that would keep the audience engaged. Successful gladiators developed a complex understanding of crowd manipulation. They learned to create dramatic combat scenarios that looked deadly while minimizing actual damage to themselves and their opponents. They mastered the art of theatrical death, learning to fake fatal wounds convincingly enough to satisfy bloodthirsty spectators while actually suffering only minor injuries. But this theatrical approach to arena combat required extensive collaboration between gladiators who were supposed to be mortal enemies. Slaves developed elaborate underground networks for sharing information about upcoming matches, crowd preferences, and the specific combat scenarios that different sponsors wanted to see. These survival networks operated in direct violation of gladiatorial school rules, but they were essential for staying alive. Gladiators created complex systems of mutual protection where experienced fighters would mentor newcomers, teaching them not just combat techniques, but the psychological strategies necessary for long-term survival in an environment designed to kill them. The mentoring relationships often involved sexual arrangements that modern audiences would find deeply disturbing. Older gladiators would claim younger fighters as their personal property, providing protection and training in exchange for sexual access and complete obedience. These relationships were simultaneously exploitative and protective, offering newcomers their only chance of survival while trapping them in degrading power dynamics. Here's where the moral complexity becomes truly horrifying. Many gladiators discovered that their best chance of survival lay in becoming active collaborators in the arena's most brutal spectacles. The crowd's favorite entertainers weren't just skilled fighters. They were slaves who had learned to perform cruelty with such enthusiasm that they seemed to genuinely enjoy torturing and killing other human beings. The most successful gladiators developed personas that combined combat skill with sadistic creativity. They became specialists in prolonged executions, learning to keep condemned criminals alive and conscious for extended periods, while inflicting increasingly grotesque injuries. The crowd rewarded this cruelty with cheers, money, and most importantly, requests for specific gladiators to appear in future games. But creating these performances required gladiators to suppress their natural human responses to violence and suffering. Many turned to drugs and alcohol to numb themselves before particularly brutal exhibitions. The gladiatorial schools provided various substances, including opium preparations and fermented beverages that could help fighters dissociate from their actions. The drug use created its own survival challenges. Gladiators who became dependent on substances for psychological coping often found their combat performance deteriorating, making them more likely to be killed in the arena. Others discovered that certain drugs actually enhanced their fighting ability while reducing their emotional responses to violence, leading to increasingly reckless behavior that could prolong their careers, but guaranteed eventual death. Sexual survival strategies extended beyond individual exploitation to complex networks of mutual protection and shared resources. Gladiators who became lovers often fought as teams, watching each other's backs during combat and sharing intelligence about upcoming matches. These relationships provided emotional support that was otherwise completely absent from their lives, but they also created devastating vulnerabilities. The arena masters quickly learned to exploit romantic relationships between gladiators as a source of dramatic tension for the crowd. They would deliberately schedule lovers to fight each other, forcing them to choose between survival and loyalty. These matches were among the most popular spectacles in the Colosseum, as audiences found the emotional anguish of the fighters almost as entertaining as the physical violence. Some gladiators chose death rather than kill their partners, creating touching displays of human love that the crowd interpreted as entertainment. Others killed their lovers to survive, then lived with guilt that drove many to suicide or deliberately suicidal combat in later matches. Either choice provided exactly the type of human drama that Roman audiences craved. Before we continue deeper into these testimonies of survival in history's most brutal arena, if this exploration of forgotten truths has opened your eyes to the reality behind Rome's greatest spectacle, consider subscribing to join this journey through the shadows of the past. These voices from the underground chambers deserve to be heard, and there are many more stories buried in history's archives waiting for someone willing to uncover them. The economic incentives that governed gladiatorial combat created perverse survival strategies that required slaves to become calculating entrepreneurs of their own exploitation. The most successful gladiators weren't just entertainers. They became small-scale business people who carefully managed their careers to maximize both survival and profit. Gladiators who survived multiple arena appearances could earn money through various means, including percentage payments from sponsors, gifts from admiring spectators, and fees for private appearances at wealthy Roman homes. This created a twisted form of celebrity culture where slaves could achieve limited fame and financial resources while remaining completely powerless and subject to execution at any moment. The pursuit of arena fame required gladiators to develop increasingly extreme specializations that would distinguish them from other fighters. Some became experts in fighting specific types of wild animals, learning the behavioral patterns of lions, bears, and exotic creatures imported from across the empire. Others specialized in particular weapon combinations or fighting styles that created distinctive visual spectacles. But the most financially successful gladiators were those who learned to combine combat skill with sexual availability for wealthy patrons. The intersection of violence and eroticism was a consistent theme in Roman entertainment, and gladiators who could satisfy both appetites commanded premium prices for private performances. These private exhibitions often involved elaborate sexual scenarios that incorporated elements of gladiatorial combat. Wealthy Romans would hire gladiators to perform mock battles that concluded with simulated or actual sexual encounters, often involving multiple participants, and increasingly bizarre scenarios designed to demonstrate the complete power of the sponsors over their human property. The gladiators who thrived in this environment developed sophisticated skills in reading the psychological needs of their wealthy patrons. They learned to perform not just physical acts, but complex emotional scenarios that satisfied their customers' desires for domination, humiliation, and control over other human beings. However, this success came with devastating psychological costs that manifested in various forms of self-destructive behavior. Many gladiators developed dissociative disorders that allowed them to disconnect from their experiences during combat and sexual exploitation. Others developed multiple personalities, creating separate identities for their arena performances and their private survival strategies. The underground chambers of the Colosseum contained facilities for gladiators to prepare themselves mentally and physically for their performances. These included spaces for drug use, sexual encounters, religious rituals, and psychological conditioning that helped fighters suppress their natural human responses to violence and degradation. Religious practices among gladiators represented another complex survival strategy that required them to reinterpret traditional beliefs in ways that could justify their participation in systematic murder. Many gladiators adopted modified versions of mystery religions that emphasized concepts of rebirth and transformation, allowing them to view their arena killings as religious acts rather than simple murder. The cult of Mithras was particularly popular among gladiators because its emphasis on courage in the face of death and the purification of the soul through violence provided a framework for understanding their arena activities as spiritually meaningful rather than morally corrupting. Gladiators would perform elaborate rituals before combat that transformed killing into religious ceremony. But these religious adaptations required gladiators to completely reconstruct their understanding of basic moral concepts like murder, compassion, and human dignity. The psychological process of making these adaptations often involved what modern psychologists would recognize as forms of moral injury that could never be fully healed, even if the gladiators somehow gained their freedom. The collaborative networks that allowed gladiators to survive extended beyond individual relationships to complex information sharing systems that operated throughout the gladiatorial schools and underground chambers. Gladiators developed elaborate codes for communicating during combat that allowed them to coordinate their performances while appearing to fight to the death. These communication systems included specific hand signals, body positions, and vocal cues that could convey information about injuries, crowd reactions, and optimal timing for dramatic moments. Gladiators who mastered these collaborative techniques could create spectacles that satisfied audience bloodlust, while actually minimizing harm to the participants. The codes also allowed experienced gladiators to warn newcomers about particularly dangerous opponents, corrupt officials, and sponsors who had reputations for demanding especially brutal performances. This information could mean the difference between survival and death for inexperienced fighters who hadn't yet learned to navigate the arena's complex social and political dynamics. However, these collaborative survival strategies created their own moral complications. Gladiators who participated in stage combat were deliberately deceiving the audiences who paid to see genuine life and death struggles. This deception required them to become skilled liars and manipulators, skills that often corrupted their relationships with other slaves and their own sense of personal integrity. The gender dynamics of gladiatorial survival created additional complications that affected both male and female fighters. Male gladiators often faced pressure to demonstrate their masculinity through increasingly violent performances, while female gladiators were expected to maintain their sexual attractiveness even while participating in brutal combat. Female gladiators developed survival strategies that required them to navigate the intersection of violence and sexuality in ways that were particularly psychologically damaging. They had to learn to fight effectively while maintaining the erotic appeal that made them valuable to sponsors, creating internal conflicts between their roles as warriors and sexual objects. Many female gladiators formed protective relationships with male fighters who could provide physical protection in exchange for sexual access. These arrangements were simultaneously exploitative and necessary, offering women some measure of security while reinforcing their subordinate status within the gladiatorial hierarchy. The most successful female gladiators learned to weaponize their sexuality as a tool for manipulating both opponents and audiences. They would use seductive behavior to distract enemies during combat, create dramatic sexual tension that enhanced crowd engagement, and develop personal relationships with wealthy sponsors that could provide protection and resources. But these strategies required women to constantly perform roles that reduced them to sexual objects, while simultaneously demanding that they be capable of deadly violence. The psychological compartmentalization necessary for maintaining these contradictory identities often resulted in severe mental health problems that were completely ignored by the gladiatorial system. The training regimens that prepared gladiators for arena combat included systematic desensitization to violence that was designed to eliminate normal human responses to killing and suffering. New gladiators were forced to participate in increasingly brutal exercises that gradually eroded their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. These training exercises included forced participation in executions of condemned criminals, practice sessions involving torture of live victims, and competitive games that rewarded gladiators for demonstrating creativity and inflicting pain. The psychological conditioning was so effective that many gladiators eventually found themselves unable to experience normal emotional responses to violence, even outside the arena context. The most psychologically devastating aspect of gladiatorial training was the requirement that slaves participate in the dehumanization of other slaves. Gladiators were forced to view condemned criminals, disabled individuals, and unsuccessful fighters as subhuman, making it psychologically easier to kill them during arena performances. This systematic dehumanization extended to the gladiators' understanding of themselves. They were taught to view their own lives as worthless, except insofar as they could provide entertainment for Roman citizens. This internalized dehumanization made it possible for gladiators to accept their exploitation, while simultaneously making it almost impossible for them to maintain any sense of personal dignity or self-worth. The medical care provided to gladiators represented another twisted aspect of their survival situation. The Romans wanted to keep their entertainment investments alive and fighting, so they developed sophisticated medical techniques for treating combat injuries. However, this medical care was designed primarily to return gladiators to fighting condition as quickly as possible, not to promote their overall health or well-being. Gladiatorial physicians became experts in treating specific types of wounds while ignoring the psychological trauma that accompanied them. They could repair torn muscles, set broken bones, and treat infected cuts with remarkable skill, but they made no effort to address the mental health problems that affected virtually every arena fighter. The medical facilities in the gladiatorial schools included primitive surgical suites, drug dispensaries, and recovery areas that provided better health care than most Roman citizens received. However, this medical attention came with the understanding that gladiators were valuable property that needed maintenance, not human beings deserving compassionate care. Gladiators quickly learned to game the medical system as part of their survival strategies. They would deliberately worsen minor injuries to avoid particularly dangerous matches, fake more serious wounds than they had actually sustained to gain additional recovery time, and develop relationships with physicians who might provide favorable medical assessments in exchange for various forms of payment. But the medical manipulation required gladiators to become experts in their own physical degradation, learning exactly how much damage they could sustain without permanently disabling themselves. This intimate knowledge of injury and pain became another form of psychological corruption that affected their relationships with their own bodies and their capacity for normal physical intimacy. The retirement strategies available to long-term gladiatorial survivors created their own moral complexities that required former fighters to continue participating in the arena system even after their active careers ended. The few gladiators who survived long enough to gain their freedom often found themselves unable to integrate into normal Roman society. Former gladiators typically remained involved in the gladiatorial system as trainers, weapons masters, or arena officials. They used their experience and connections to help other slaves survive, but this meant continuing to participate in a system they knew was designed to destroy human beings. The moral compromise was necessary for economic survival, but it meant that even freedom didn't provide escape from the arena's corrupting influence. Some retired gladiators became entrepreneurs who owned or operated gladiatorial schools, essentially becoming slave masters themselves. They justified this career path by arguing that they provided better treatment and training than other lanistai. But they were still fundamentally involved in the business of processing human beings for entertainment purposes. The psychological profiles of long-term gladiatorial survivors reveal the devastating impact of extended participation in systematized violence and exploitation. Former gladiators typically displayed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as complex trauma disorders, including emotional numbing, hypervigilance, dissociation, and severe difficulties with interpersonal relationships. Many former gladiators never developed the capacity for normal romantic or sexual relationships because their arena experiences had so thoroughly corrupted their understanding of intimacy and human connection. They often remained isolated and emotionally damaged for the rest of their lives, unable to trust other people or experience normal emotional responses to everyday situations. The few detailed accounts of gladiatorial careers that survive from ancient sources reveal the progressive moral and psychological deterioration that affected virtually everyone who participated in the arena system for extended periods. Even the most successful gladiators typically describe their careers in terms that suggest profound regret and self-loathing. However, these same accounts also reveal the incredible resilience and ingenuity that allowed some slaves to survive in an environment designed to kill them. The survival strategies developed by gladiators represent some of the most sophisticated responses to systematic oppression in recorded history, even though they came at devastating personal costs. The legacy of gladiatorial survival strategies extended beyond the arena itself to influence Roman society's understanding of violence, power, and human dignity. The systematic dehumanization that occurred in the Colosseum provided a template for other forms of oppression throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans' casual acceptance of gladiatorial brutality normalized extreme violence in ways that affected their treatment of slaves, conquered peoples, and even their own citizens. The arena became a school for cruelty that taught Roman society to view systematic oppression as entertainment rather than moral catastrophe. But the gladiators' survival strategies also demonstrated the incredible capacity of human beings to adapt to even the most extreme circumstances while maintaining some vestige of their humanity. Even in the depths of the arena system, slaves found ways to protect each other, preserve relationships, and maintain hope for something better. The networks of mutual support and protection that gladiators created within the constraints of their oppression represent important examples of resistance and resilience that deserve recognition alongside the horror of their circumstances. These slaves refused to be completely dehumanized, even when doing so might have made their survival easier. The moral complexity of gladiatorial survival strategies challenges simple narratives about oppression and resistance. The gladiators were simultaneously victims and participants, resistors and collaborators, human beings fighting for survival, and entertainment products performing for crowd approval. Their experiences reveal the devastating impact of systematic oppression on human psychology and morality. But they also demonstrate the incredible strength required to maintain any sense of humanity under such extreme circumstances. The gladiators of the Colosseum faced choices that no human being should ever have to make, and their responses reveal both the depths of human degradation and the heights of human resilience. As we reach the end of this journey into the underground chambers of the Colosseum, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the survival strategies developed by Roman slaves reveal timeless patterns of human behavior under extreme oppression. The specific circumstances were unique to ancient Rome, but the psychological dynamics they created continue to manifest in modern forms of systematic exploitation and abuse. The gladiators who fought and died in the Colosseum developed survival strategies that required them to abandon fundamental moral principles, exploit other victims, and participate enthusiastically in their own dehumanization. These choices were rational responses to impossible circumstances, but they created psychological and moral damage that could never be fully healed. Understanding these survival strategies doesn't excuse the Roman system that created them, but it does provide insight into the incredible complexity of human responses to oppression. The gladiators were neither heroes nor villains. They were human beings trapped in a system designed to destroy them, using whatever tools they could find to stay alive one more day. Their experiences remind us that survival itself can become a form of resistance, even when it requires choices that violate our deepest moral convictions. The slaves of the Colosseum refused to die quietly, even when staying alive meant participating in their own exploitation. Their determination to survive, regardless of the cost, represents a fundamental assertion of human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The voices from the underground chambers of the Colosseum speak across the centuries to remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the devastating impact of systems designed to reduce people to objects for others' entertainment. Their testimonies deserve to be heard not as sensational stories, but as warnings about the capacity for human cruelty and the price of systematic oppression. If this exploration into the shadows of human experience has revealed truths about survival and resistance that you hadn't considered before, subscribe to continue this journey through history's most challenging testimonies. These forgotten voices from the arena's depths have much more to teach us about the full spectrum of human experience under extreme circumstances. Remember their names, honor their suffering, and recognize their humanity. The gladiators of the Colosseum were not entertainment. They were human beings who developed extraordinary survival strategies under unimaginable circumstances. Their legacy reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, the human spirit finds ways to endure, resist, and ultimately transcend the systems designed to destroy it.